So our group was looking at the goal 2 around, zero hunger. And we decided to start at the bottom of the list of objectives and work our way backwards. And we got about 3 in. So just to give you a flavour of, because there's quite a bit of discussion. I suppose the first point, although we're very much looking at what does it mean here in Ireland, in the wording of it, it did refer explicitly mentioned least developed countries. So our starting point was actually looking at examples of work being done by Teagasc and by the ICSA, Irish Cattle and Sheep Farm Association, in countries like Botswana or in Ethiopia and Botswana. But then I suppose we brought it back to Ireland, and we recognised that we cannot impose systems on countries and on places, that we need to be very specific and relevant to the areas within Ireland. There's very different types of agriculture going on, east and west, north and south, and so on. Not one approach to be used. We also went on to talk about that, we recognise that protecting genetic diversity, having seed banks and so on, is not something that is just relevant to developing and least developed countries, but it is very relevant in Ireland. The next point we were focusing on was the whole area of subsidies. And there was a recognition that the direction in Ireland is to eliminate subsidies more broadly, but that's an incremental process. We felt that there is need to encourage development of local sustainable economies. That particularly that whole issue about kind of, the amount of fossil fuels and so on involved in the import and export of agricultural goods, so that we need to support and promote local sustainable economies in our implementation of the sustainable goals. It was felt by the group that removal of subsidies needs to be prioritised with timelines in the implementation of the goals. But equally, there was a voice saying we need to look specifically on a case-by-case basis to see, is it always in communities and people's benefit to remove subsidies and supports. There was an issue around, are we talking about economic issues? Is that the bottom line all the time? What about moral responsibility? It was felt that any Irish agricultural policy must embrace the Sustainable Development Goals, including, for example, if we increase our head of cattle, like where is all that manure going? Where is all the feed going to be coming from? What are the impacts of all of those kinds of aspects? A positive example of that we can use the opportunities, if we have increased kind of agricultural productivity and so on, can we incentivize farmers in rural communities? For example, the example of low carbon cement was used, and other benefits in terms of energy. Another point that was made was the need for real coherence between our agricultural policy and the objectives within the individual goals. And that's a broader point than just goal 2. But I suppose we finished up by making the point that one thing in Ireland is that we are there is good work being done. We are ahead of the curve. So we have a we can feel positive that we can actually do this here in Ireland, but also maybe be a lead internationally on this as well. So sorry, that's a very rushed summary of what we discussed.
That's great, thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you very much, Johnny Sheehan.
Thanks very much, Michael. This is an impossible task, but like the whole thing, it's I think when you're doing transformation, we're going to change everything before us. I think what we started really talking about, because we rambled a little bit at the beginning, we started talking about responsible and sustainable, the words, and we didn't want to jettison the sustainable, even though it's very much abused now. It's lost an awful lot of its meaning. But we think actually putting responsible, which has an indication of the individual taking responsibility, or the group, or Ireland, or whatever it is, putting that with sustainable, the two words together. So even though they may not appear together, that would be one thing that we would strongly recommend. The other thing we had a brief discussion about was if you like, the parameters setting the whole thing. There seems to be in the whole, well, particularly in the one that we were looking at, responsible consumption and production, there was an assumption of economic growth. So you can see it there, it's under 8, decent work and economic growth. And we were saying that the whole of our economic model at the moment is based on that, and we question that, and there are plenty of alternative models out there. The organisation that I'm involved in, one of them anyway, FASTA, has a number of different models, and there's plenty of thinking, and there are a lot of people who believe in degrowth, and we started off down that road, but we certainly agreed that we need a different discourse around economic models and growth. The next thing we talked about was a sense of balance in terms of sustainability. That is taking care of the present, taking care of the future, taking care of developed countries, and a responsibility for the so-called developing countries. I think that's the language that's there, and how you do that through economics. And again, we came back down to changing behaviour and that, and I'm going to come back to that at the very end. Next thing we talked about was the whole the need for a raw materials strategy in Ireland, or a natural resources strategy. There's a lot of data there about all that makes up the earth, the soil, the minerals, the air, the sea, and so on. But it's not drawn together. So there's a need for an integrated, almost like a baseline study as to where we're at. Wood, water, agriculture, all of those things. What have we got? What are our natural resources? Pulling it all together and coming up with a strategic approach to it, and metrics on it as well. In general, around the particular goals, we said to use the good old SMART, and we talked a little bit about metrics and so on, so you could do that, and we were aware that CSO is coming up with some indicators and indices, and they need to be brought down to local level. 1 minute. No, okay. So we talked a lot about waste and labelling being complex for waste at the moment, so coming up with a new system. We talked about the roles of manufacturers, retailers, supermarkets, and how they pull together, and maybe some kind of a labelling that consumers could identify who are the wasters, shall we put it that way, and they would go and act that way. We talked about the difference between, if you like, production-led waste and how communities are doing their own thing, community-led initiatives. So that's like putting a face on the farmer and so on locally, and where there's a glut of a product that it can be used. We said green public procurement, GPP, is very, very important, but it is very challenging, and we need to take a basic approach. Chemicals and waste, we felt there's a lot of good work going on in Europe, and we don't really need to focus on it compared to all the other stuff. I suppose overall what we came to was that what's needed is a profound shift in values, if we're talking about Ireland. And one way of helping that would be education. So we talked about has already been submissions to the Department of Education 2013 on education for sustainable development, not just in schools and so on, but in general for people, and we weren't clear where that was at. And in this whole, if you like, shift in values, really understanding what we need and what we want, and the impact on our consumption and production. If we manage to do that, we'll transform the country. Thank you.
When we were discussing climate change, two themes really emerged from the whole thing, and they're very similar. The first is a need for a bottom-up approach for dealing with climate change. And the second one is the need for community buy-in and ownership, and they really are the same thing when you get down to it. We did have a call for civil disobedience as well, though, which is again is as bottom-up and community-based as you can get. But we discussed things like electric cars being powered by locally generated electricity being used as buffers for the national grid, which again is really a community thing. We discussed civil and religious communities as a basis for action, and Laudato Si, being the call for action from the Pope. But the difficulty of the community influencing these plans and government policy was also touched on. And again, it's back to the bottom-up approach. But we noted that local authorities are in the middle of producing the 5 years local economic and community plans. And that is a window for us to actually make a change now that will have some effect. If we miss this, we're going to have to wait 5 years to influence the next community plans. But there's a definite lack of a political understanding. The whole idea of sustainable development, local authorities don't understand what sustainable means. They seem to have forgotten the wider meaning of sustainable, and think sustainable means will it generate jobs. We got on to low-hanging fruit. Solar electricity was mentioned as a good possibility that Ireland can handle, or will be at about 80% as efficient as a panel in Spain. So that's still quite good. We have long days, but we don't have a feed-in tariff. We don't have a way of selling your the electricity that you're not using immediately back to the national grid, and that will kill this from the start. If people don't have a way of monetizing it and actually making the panel pay for itself, it will never happen. So that's something that's needed. There's a white paper being produced at the moment, and if we could get the basis for a feed-in tariff in there, it would be a good start. It's also solar electricity is probably the most community acceptable one. When we talk about wind turbines, there's always difficulties. No one seems to have that big an objection to solar. So there's a way of there's a way of getting communities to at least accept and understand locally generated, community generated electricity, and the contribution that will make towards climate change. We also talked about communicating the message and the need to make it personal. And again, this is back to community and bottom up. People have to understand it and believe it's going to affect them before it will. And Judy gave us the example of her county manager who accepts that climate change is real, but it's not going to happen for 100 years. So it really doesn't matter to him. We need people to understand. We have to make it real for people. And finally, and very importantly, TTIP got mentioned, and the danger that if that's accepted, we will end up importing climate change. I'm not even going to get into explaining TTIP. If you don't know what it is, you need to learn about it. But I think we all know. Anyway, that's really what we covered.
If you see somebody on a beach on a gorgeous sunny day and they're in a wetsuit, that's me. So I really was in the wrong group, but I was surrounded by very passionate, very purposeful and very informed people. So I apologise in advance if I haven't quite captured the depth. And we had a very, very productive group. They had loads of ideas, and I'm not even going to try and theme them, but there were themes actually emerging, themes of governance, themes of community involvement, particularly in coastal regions. But I am just going to try and tell you what we said, and apologies for the lack of categorisation. We started off with a very, very concrete recommendation that really, to start sorting this out, you need fully documented fisheries And we were told that that is quite easily done. You have observers on vessels, that creates new jobs, up to 250, and we use the technology to stop the illegal fisheries. And there was even an extremely personal proposal from Seal Sanctuary that they would actually like to see boats that are going to be decommissioned going to overseas communities who need them, and that they would work on this particular project. So you can't get more concrete and hands-on than that. As I said, I'm the wetsuit lady. We viewed water as a commodity, a natural resource, so it needed to be looked at across all of the various elements that have resonance here. Waterproofing strategies such as Harvest 2020 needed to be done. Somebody said, why are we eating fish? Is that not based on research 40 years out of date? And now plants can produce omega-3. So maybe we need to have a look at examining the consumption of patterns of fish consumption. Sorry, you know what I'm saying there. So there was lots of things, and I'm being very scattergun, and I'm sorry, I don't feel I'm doing justice. Down to governance and cohesion and policy coherence. At a national level, it was made clear to us that we have a 6-mile zone that's our sea. So we really need to be on top of how that is being protected. And also the public needs to be aware of this. And the public needs to be aware of the impact of marine life on unsustainable fishing. We actually, apparently, and I didn't know this, import 2/3 of our fish consumption from much more unsustainable sources. And if we really need to get on top of that huge big challenge. If specified from the point of view of policy coherence, the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, how am I doing on time? The Action Plan for Integration, the Marine Strategy Framework Work Directive. Oh God, this is terrible. We need an action plan to integrate the departments of the marine and environment. That may seem like a no-brainer, but apparently that needs to be much more smarter, done in a smarter way, and we really need to get on top of that. But a complementary strand from Cecil was saying, really, at a supra-global level, ocean governance is the big game in town, and we need to be a player there. As Hans said earlier this morning, the international agreements are the way to go. They are the blueprint for getting this right. So Ireland needs to be a player there, we need to be a contributor, and we need to be doing that in various elements. So I think, have I tried to capture what we said? Yeah? Okay, I'll start, yeah, okay. So I'm going to remove my wetsuit now, ladies, thank you.